Hi, and welcome to the next preparatory video on the history of English 2, English and its Germanic relatives. In this video, we end our block on modern English. And what we'll do is the following. We'll discuss three different developments that happened during the so-called late modern English period, meaning basically the 19th century. And we start with the expansion of the progressive. So when I talk about progressive, what I mean is the combination of the auxiliary to be with a verb and the suffix ing. And this allows us in English to make certain spatial distinctions. One of these distinctions is, for example, the difference between a perfective and an imperfective interpretation of an event, right? So we have here the two example sentences. When we arrived, she called the police, and when we arrived, she was calling the police. And now if we focus on the event of calling the police, we can either interpret it as something that ended, right? She called the police. Or we can interpret it as that it was still not finished when we arrived, right? That's why we use the ing form, the progressive. And similarly, we can also differentiate between a durative and a punctual reading of an event, right? So they argued and they were arguing also offers a different view of the argument. The one is sort of again, a closed one-off event, whereas the other is suggesting that the argument took some time. Also, the difference between Jeffrey is himself today or Jeffrey is being himself, again, also tells you something about how long this state of affairs lasts. However, the verb that can be used in such a progressive construction cannot be just any verb. There are certain restrictions, more or less strict, but for example, stative verbs, such as verbs that describe a state of affairs, right? For example, London is the capital of England. This is something that we can hardly use in the progressive sense, right? So London is being in England or is being the capital of England is really weird and could only be used in a very restricted context. The same would also go for verbs of possession, verbs of mental states, and so forth, right? So for example, if I have a pet dog, I can not say I am having a pet dog. And this would mean something else, but if I want to say that I possess a pet, then I cannot use the progressive form. What's more is also that we have there are basically no restrictions as to the form of the auxiliary to be in the progressive construction. So the auxiliary can be in the passive form, right? The house is being built. We can also have participles. He has been being interrogated. There can be also different modal verbs and different auxiliaries combined with to be, so that we have something like it should have been being handled accordingly. But this is not something that was always the case, right? So, and this is what we're going to have a look at now. In the early modern English and late modern English period, for example, the passive progressive is absolutely not okay. Instead, what is used is the so-called passival construction, which is basically a present participle with passive meaning. Examples of this are, you can see here, for example, the bridge is building, meaning is being built, or our garden is putting in order, is being put in order, or the meal was eating, meaning the meal was being eaten, and the trunks were carrying down, meaning were being carried down. So what we have here is something that we also know from present-day English. We call it the middle voice, and sometimes we use formally active constructions, which are, however, understood as having a passive meaning, right? So, for example, the window broke. This looks like an active sentence or active expression, but we know that it was not the window that did something, but there was someone else who did something to the window and the window broke. The same goes for constructions such as the door opens or the car drives like a tank, right? It's not that the car does something, someone else does something to the car, and so forth. So what we see here during the late modern English period is that the auxiliary is also restricted, so that there are certain things that the auxiliary cannot do. Similarly to the constraints that we have on the choice of the verb, of the main verb for this construction in present-day English. Right, so here are some more examples of this construction from the 19th century. So the first one, this is something that we've already seen. Our garden is putting in order, is being put in order. But there are others, like, but are there 6 laborer sons educating in the universities at the moment? Right? The street lamps were lighting. Here, baskets had been carrying, were being carried. Right? And here, theater where a ballet's dancing was being danced. Okay. There were also certain constraints for the passival, such as, for example, no intransitive verbs were possible in this construction, right? So verbs without an object, like go, for example. But this is also logical and to be expected in passive constructions. What's important here is also that the passival construction can be used with human as well as non-human / non-agentive subjects, right? So this is the bit of the table at the bottom right, in the bottom right corner, when we see that the passival progressive was possible for non-agentive subjects, so subjects that cannot be the agents. Dinner was preparing, right? It was someone else who was preparing the dinner. But it was also possible with agentive and human subjects, such as, are there 6 laborers' sons educating in the universities? So sons can be agents. And this is important when we have a look at these at uses of the so-called passival with animate or agentive subjects, because then we will see that these constructions can get ambiguous, and we cannot be certain, if we don't have the right context, whether the sentence is active or passive. So if we take this example, are there 6 laborers' sons educating in the universities at this moment? There is one possible reading, and this would be the sons are being educated by someone else, so they are students at the universities. But there is also the possibility that it's not them who are being educated, but they are lecturers at a university and they are educating someone else, right? So ambiguous construction here. So what we see is that during the 19th century, the constraints on the main verb and the auxiliary disappear gradually, so that in present-day English there are basically no constraints as to the auxiliary. The constraints for the main verb, they still are in place, as we know. And then at the same time, sort of hand in hand, goes also the reduction of the possible interpretations of that construction. So whereas the passival in the beginning of the 19th century can either be active or passive, the same construction in present-day English can only be interpreted as active, right? So the 6 laborers' sons are educating cannot be interpreted as a passive event in present-day English. And this is something that we really can see during the 19th century, right, and the beginning of the 19th century. So whereas in the second half of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, we see actually more passival than the passive progressive. This completely changes during the middle of the 19th century, around 1815, when the passival basically disappears and the passive progressive, the construction that we know nowadays, is completely dominant, right? So approximately around the middle of the 19th century. This doesn't mean that passive progressives were not existent in English before the 19th century. There were other ways of expressing this, not only the so-called passival, but for example in Old English there was the combination of the auxiliary to be with a participle ending with ende, right? So he was huntjende, he was hunting, or right, with adjectives, he was blissjende, he was happy, and also sort of locative constructions that were very similar. He was on huntinge, he was hunting. And this this last example with the locative construction is also something that we know from other Germanic languages. For example, German and Dutch, right? So for example, in German there is this am progressive construction. Ist am Schreiben. Very similarly in Dutch, hij is aan het schrijven. He is currently writing something. A similar locative construction, very archaic, is also still possible in present-day English, but as I said, it's really archaic, and it's only in very fossilized contexts to be found, right? So for example, a Christmas carol, the 12 Days of Christmas, there are these swimming constructions, and this is basically a reduced form of the old preposition, the locative preposition. Okay. But now let's move to the second development that happened during the 19th century, and that's the rise of the perfect auxiliary have. So if we compare the different Germanic languages with English, what we'll see is that English, like North Germanic languages and Afrikaans, uses only one auxiliary in all the different present perfect constructions. This is something that's unlike the Dutch and German situation, where there are two different auxiliaries, have and be. So in English, in present-day English, we have I have built a house alongside I have arrived. So in both contexts here, we see the same auxiliary. It's only in very archaic biblical historicizing contexts that we see something else. For example, in this famous Oppenheimer quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It's I am become, and not, as we would expect nowadays, I have become death. And this is basically the thing that was, and if we look at the 19th century English, late modern English basically looks like more like Dutch and German than present day English in this respect. Because there are still these two auxiliaries, have and be. And whereas in present day English we would say I have arrived, this verb would require the auxiliary to be. I was arrived. The same goes for I am come and I am become. And this is the distribution of these two auxiliaries is something that those of you who speak German and Dutch very much know already, right? So mutative verbs and verbs of movement, basically verbs that express either movement or change of states, change of affairs, those verbs use the auxiliary be, whereas other verbs use the auxiliary have. Right? So Jana ist gelaufen instead of hat gelaufen. Jana ist reich geworden instead of hat reich geworden. And if we take a look at this table, which shows the percentage of mutative verbs, so verbs again expressing change or movement, and the percentage of the combination of those verbs with the auxiliary have, we see that already sort of during the 18th century, it's still more than half of those verbs are used with the auxiliary to be. Right? So, and only about 40% in the beginning of the 19th century are used with the auxiliary have. But this changes approximately in the first third of the 19th century. And from there until the end of the 19th century, until the end of the late modern English period, we see a steep rise. And at the end, around 1900, we see that almost all mutative verbs are used with the auxiliary have. Okay, and now a last development, and that is the passive constructions with get. So nowadays in present-day English, we have two different ways of expressing a passive or creating a passive construction. So there is one, the so-called standard passive. The trees in the garden were damaged in the wind when we use the auxiliary to be. But there is also this other option to use the so-called get passive. The trees in the garden got damaged in the wind. Right? They are both have a passive reading, but there are certain differences between those two. One of them is that the get passive is often perceived as more informal and is more used in negative contexts, right? So it's got sacked, got fired, get criticized, get stolen, and so forth. The constraint towards more negative contexts is quite obviously not absolute, because there is always, for example, the possibility to say something like get promoted, get married, which is a positive thing. And if we take a look at how this get passive developed in the 19th century, we see that before that happened, there was a gradual rise in the use of other get constructions. And those are, for example, those were, for example, the combination of the auxiliary get with an adjective, or the combination of get with a noun phrase and an adjective, sort of a causative, to cause something to be a certain, to be somehow, to get something. And also a reflexive construction with the reflexive pronoun oneself and a participle. Right? So she got herself arrested. Right, this was also possible. And after those constructions, we also see a rise of the so-called get passive, so the combination of get and a participle. And this is again something that happens approximately around the year 1850, so around the half of the 19th century. Right, so get passives were almost non-existent during the early modern English period, during the 18th century and earlier, and then we see again a steep rise during the 19th century. And we see that this get passive is the development of this construction is somewhat slower than the development of other get constructions, such as the combination of get with adjectives. Okay, so what we've seen in this video so far. So we've seen that during the late modern English period, during the 19th century, there was a demise of the so-called passival construction and a rise of progressive passives. We've also seen the steep rise of the use of the auxiliary have for verbs of movement or change. And finally, we've also seen the rise of the so-called get passives, passives that use get as an auxiliary. And all these three constructions, all these three developments will be something that we'll take a look at in grammar books from the 19th century during our next online session. And so for that online session, I would ask you to have a look at the handout and answer the questions that are here below. Until then, thank you for listening, thank you for watching. See you during our online session. Bye.